So in the last decade, climate has become more variable, and climate extremes has increased in number and intensity. And this includes not only extreme temperatures, but also increasing spatial variability, as I mentioned. And that is what really is affecting many countries in the world. So the strongest direct impacts are felt in countries where agriculture is sensitive to these climate changes, especially where agriculture is a major source of food and livelihoods for the rural poor. So as a result, the food security and nutrition of the small farmers are the most affected by changing climate, because normally they will be in areas which are more vulnerable. And specifically, this is the world's 2.5 billion small-scale farmers, so herders, fisheries, and forest-dependent communities who derive their food and income from renewable natural resources. In that sense, the impacts of climate will affect them and will also undermine the food security and nutrition. And they could also generate some food price spikes in local markets, which could even more exacerbate their situation. Climate change also heavily impacts nutrition through impaired nutrient and quality and dietary diversity of foods produced and consumed, and impacts on water and sanitation, with their implications for patterns of health risk and disease. Where climate extremes are prolonged or recurrent, climate extremes lead to diminishing coping capacity, loss of livelihoods, distress of migration, and destitution. So a problem that this report tried to underline is that we need to take into consideration this special driver, but also economic downturns and slowdowns. Why? Because what happens when you have less income, so less capacity of access, is automatically you will be moving to a situation where you eat a lower quality diet. And today we know, and even in 2020, we are talking of around 3 billion people don't having access to the cheapest cost healthy diet. Now, with the shock of COVID-19 and the slowdown that this is generating and the recession in many countries, this will immediately affect the quality of diets. So it's not only increasing undernourishment, but it's also increasing all forms of malnutrition. This is a very special case for a middle class, for example, in countries which have huge informal economies. Why? Because when you have the lockdowns, the sectors that were the most affected were the services, for example, and those are mostly informal in Latin America, in Asia, and Africa, and also the rural sector, but especially on the peri-urban, urban areas. These households, which already had an income, informal income, which was over poverty, abruptly are losing all their income revenue. And that is affecting tremendously their food access, and it's affecting also the quality of the diets. So the impacts are multidimensional, are not only in the rural areas, are also in peri-urban and urban, and especially huge impacts in regions with significant levels of informality. If you look at Latin America, in average, we have 54.4% of informality. That region has shown significant increase in food insecurity as a result of COVID-19, and a significant part of this, and especially the reduction of the medium class that was growing in the last decade, is because of the significant presence of informality that was completely chopped because of the stop of economic activity in those countries, because of the prolonged time of the lockdown periods, which we can increase their resilience. And increasing their resilience means not only trying to avoid the shock to happen, so being preventive, but also trying to have and give them the tools and the elements to be able to cope better when these shocks happen. Remember, part of these shocks, like the case of COVID-19, has significant level of uncertainty. So it's not only a risk, it's uncertain because we don't know the distribution probability of the consequences of COVID-19. We are just starting to learn. And therefore, we need to have smallholder farmers that can have certain capacity to cope with this uncertain shock, but also capacity to cope with risk. Now, to cope with risks, we need to find ways in which we can increase their access to financial resources, and that's where certain level of formality could help. We'd also need to find ways in which we can give them more access to insurance, agricultural insurance, which could be index or traditional insurance. There has been a lot of innovation in this sector, but still we are not at the level of access that is supposed to be needed. And we need to find ways to expand that and to create mechanisms that will allow them to ensure what they have, so that if there is a shock or there is a risk of a shock, especially because of climate, for example, they have a cushion through an insurance mechanism that will allow them to avoid depleting their liquidity. Also, we need to find ways in which we can improve and reduce the transaction costs they face, and that is information. We need to provide them more information so that they can improve the way in which they operate with markets. And digital technology has shown to be a good mechanism during COVID-19 to do that. But we know that there is still a significant digital divide. especially between rural and urban and within rural on the poorest areas. So here is where governments can play a bigger role, because deploying broadband is not so expensive. The important thing here is to do this investment and then find mechanisms through the private sector or other operators to create competition so that everybody can have access to these digital technologies. And also we need to find ways in which to make digital technology successful, you need to have mechanisms of access through infrastructure. So value chain infrastructure, roads, connecting smallholders to markets. And finally, one thing that I think is extremely important in the case of smallholders is that we need to find ways in which we can accelerate the process of creating mechanisms to create aggregation. So aggregation of what they produce with the standards so that they can link to markets and they can sell their produce with the correct incentive, financial incentives on price revenues for the efforts they will do to be able to comply with those standards.